And thank you for joining us today. I'm sure that you are all busy, so I appreciate you taking some time out, possibly skipping your lunch to be here today with us. Please feel free to ask any questions. We're a pretty small group, so you can just jump in or put it in the chat. Kate's going to monitor the chat for me. I am going to talk today about just how to navigate the process of early intervention in child find. I know that's a thing that can be really complicated to understand. And so hopefully today I will be able to help better your understanding of that process. Okay, I'm already having technical problems. Okay. So I have been in special education for about 23 years. I am the parent of 2 children, and I need to update that photo because that bigger kid in that photo just started at ASU a couple of weeks ago, and the small child is in middle school now. So I think I need to get taken some more recent photos here, but I currently work for child parent centers in Tucson, and I'm the special education director. I have spent my career primarily in preschool and early childhood as a special education integrated preschool teacher. And then I spent time as an evaluator. And so I am really familiar with the process. And then now I help support families through that process as well. So I've also, I'm from Tucson, and when I graduated from college, I moved away to Cincinnati for 12 years because I needed some grass and trees in my life. And then after a while, I decided I needed to come back to the desert. So I'm back here where I'm from. And I am a lover of the desert now that I've had a chance to be away. So today my hope is to help demystify the process of evaluation and services for young children. We're going to talk about the AzIP process, the Arizona Early Intervention process, as well as the school district process for evaluation, which is often referred to as child find. We'll talk about the timelines that these agencies are required to follow. We'll delve in a little bit to the screening and evaluation process. And then we'll talk a little bit about understanding an IEP. And hopefully we'll have time to talk about some different service options that are available once you've gone through this process. So here in Arizona, we have what we often refer to as AzIP, which is short for the Arizona Early Intervention Programs. And that is through the Department of Economic Security. And so this program is available all throughout our state, and you are assigned a service provider based on your zip code. So they collaborate with a lot of different agencies throughout the state to provide the direct services. So here in Tucson, we have 2 primary ones that I usually work with, and it's based on your zip code. And so we have Dynamite Kids and Rise that are the 2 most common that you see in the Tucson, Pima County area. So some things to know about AzIP are that it's for children birth to 3 years old. So sometimes children right when they're born can be referred to AzIP and can qualify based on just if you're born with certain qualifying conditions like Down syndrome, then you can right away qualify for AzIP services. But you're also able to go onto their website or to call them to start a referral at any point. And it doesn't need to come from your doctor. So parents, educators, service providers all have the opportunity to start a referral process. And when you go to the AzIP website, there's a box. You can check if you're the family member or if you're a related service professional that works with the family. So we're able to assist families with this process, as well as then share our contact information with the AzIP provider in order to help the families stay tethered. And children can be referred to AzIP until they're 2 years, 10 and a half months old. So basically 45 days before their 3rd birthday, they can still go to AzIP. So it does transfer over to the school district once children are 3 years old. The services are provided in the home from AzIP, and they use a family services model. So as we know, when you're working with young children, you really need the families on board in order to provide services in the best way. So AzIP really focuses on helping the family learn ways in which to support the family. So all of the goals that they write are based on the parent and the child's needs, and they are able to be carried on by the family. And the hope is, right, that the providers teach the family how to best help the child, and then the family's able to keep that up in the interim before the next meeting with the service provider comes. And a great thing about getting involved with AzIP early is that they are responsible for providing the transition to school-age services. So when a child is nearing their 3rd birthday, AzIP gets in touch with the school district that the child will be transferring to, and they begin with the transition process. And the goal is that services with the school district are to be in place by the 3rd birthday. So when you are already involved with AzIP, it's a lot easier to make sure that your child has services right by the time that they're 3, because it can take a long time with school districts to get scheduled for the screenings and evaluations, but AzIP has a responsibility to ensure that those are done by the 3rd birthday. So it's kind of a fast track into the district services because of the relationship that AzIP has with them. Here's some information about how to contact AzIP. And really, you can just search up Arizona Early Intervention and you'll find all of this easily on the internet. The online form is nice, but if you are not comfortable with that, or you have a family that prefers to call, they accept referrals over the phone as well. And from that initial phone call, they have 45 days to complete the evaluation and get services into place. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So once the referral is made, you can expect to have a phone call within 2 days to set up the initial contact. And then from that initial contact, then they have 10 days to meet with you for the first time. For the last several years, AzIP has been providing everything virtually since the pandemic. They switched to virtual, and I'm very happy to report that they finally have now switched back to in-person services. Unless a family prefers to stay virtual, then they're still willing to do that, but all of their screenings and services have been virtual for the last couple of years. And so I've had a lot of families that declined services because they knew that wasn't the best way for their kids to be receiving support. So I'm really happy that they're now back doing the screenings in person as well, because I felt like that was a little bit tricky when you're not in person with the child. So I think that's good news. And then after you've had that initial contact, that is the screening. So they will do, they'll ask you a lot of questions. They'll do some developmental questionnaires. They'll do observations of the child. They will try to, check the child's skills depending on the age, and then determine if they qualify for services. If they do qualify for services, then they need to make sure that within that 45-day timeline, they've developed the plan. And the plan that AzIP creates is called the Individual Family Services Plan, IFSP. And so that should be developed within the 45 days, as I mentioned. Because AzIP has the family services model, it's a bit different than school age services in that your service provider might be a speech therapist, or she might just be someone, or they, I should say, not she, they might have been a special education teacher, they might have been a physical therapist, but it will just primarily be one person that provides services to the family unless there are severe needs in other areas. So sometimes there might be a physical therapist, but generally your service provider is the one person who provides services in all areas. So some tips I like to share with the families that I work with for qualifying for AzIP is that you should provide any additional documentation that you have to them. So their screening process is fairly brief. So I feel like whenever parents have already sought outside resources, it's really beneficial to bring all of that to the evaluation. Just the more information you can have, the more likely your child is to qualify. In Arizona, we have pretty strict guidelines for qualifying for early intervention. They're a lot more stringent than they are in other states. So our qualification rates for AzIP are not fantastic. So that's why I'm always recommending that you bring as many things as you can to those evaluations as possible. I always recommend that parents make a list of their concerns, because sometimes in the moment, it can be a little bit stressful to be meeting with professionals and your child is there and you're not sure, necessarily, sometimes you're just not thinking about all the things that you were concerned about. So I always encourage people to come with the list of their concerns that they have for their child. If there's a professional that works with your child and they're willing to come along with you, I find that to be really helpful. I try to attend those evaluations whenever I can, just because I can help translate sometimes to the parents when they don't understand maybe the way the questions are worded, or and again, I think sometimes parents are overwhelmed, so it's nice to just have a third party there that can help make the evaluation go smoothly. I always recommend too that if you're not hearing back from your AzIP service provider in a timely fashion, to please follow up with them. People get busy sometimes. They might have your number incorrect. I just always encourage parents to take responsibility to follow up if they feel like things are taking too long. And as I mentioned, it's pretty difficult to qualify for AzIP. You have to have a severe delay in order to qualify for services, but you are able to re-refer your child. And so if you've gone through the process and they don't qualify, because it is based on age norms. So once your child is a few months older, then they might be able to qualify. And so there's no rules about how often or how long it has to take in between referrals. So I just encourage parents, like, try again, because maybe they'll have passed that age gap and then they might be able to qualify. All right, so once your child is nearing turning 3, they will be transferred if they're in AzIP, or if you are seeking services, you'll be going through your local school district at this point. And that is what we call Child Find. And so any public school, including charter schools, that takes federal dollars is required to have a Child Find process that they use. And so this is the process of, schools screen all of their children within the first 45 days of them coming. And parents can reach out when they have concerns if their children are not already enrolled in school. So based on the district where you live, you will find the who you need to get in contact with. And because it's based on the district where you live, keep in mind that if your child goes to, daycare or, stays with a relative or something like that, it still has to be at their district of residence. And so this process is for 3 to 5-year-olds, but they can be referred as they're approaching their 3rd birthday. So most districts will start to schedule at 2 years, 10 months. As I mentioned, you want to go to your district of residence. And this process falls under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So all of the timelines and rules for IDEA start when your child turns 3 years old and enters into this process. So what you can expect in this process, first and foremost, is a whole bunch of paperwork. So when you reach out to make the referral, you will be asked to provide a multitude of things. First and foremost, birth certificate, proof of address is generally something that school districts want to see so they can make sure that they're actually the ones responsible for providing this service for you. And in my experience, I currently work with 16 different school districts in my position, and usually school districts want 2 forms of proof of residency, and it needs to be mailed to your home. They really want to see your home address on something that's not necessarily junk mail, so like a bill or something like that. Occasionally, districts will agree to send you something, and then you can use that as a proof of address for them. But it can be hard sometimes, especially when families are maybe living with grandparents or something, because they don't have a lot of bills, maybe in their name. So you can work with the school district to figure that out. They will ask you for a developmental history. And they will ask you to complete a home language survey. And then again, any additional documentation that you can share with them, any outside evaluations, any previous information from doctors will be really helpful to give them at this point. Once you've completed that paperwork packet, they will schedule you for a screening. And different districts do this in different ways. In Cincinnati, we started off our screenings, and then if we had concerns, we immediately switched the meeting to an evaluation, and we would have parents sign permission. Here in TUSD, they do an arena screening once a week where they invite 20 families, and they have like 6 different classrooms, and in one room is the speech therapist and the hearing and the vision and the special education teacher and the occupational therapist, and families rotate around because the screening for preschool children is in all 5 areas of development. And so even if you're only concerned about speech, they're obligated to just screen all 5 areas of development just to rule out any other issues that might be there. Once you've completed the screening, if there are concerns that have arisen from that, then you will be scheduled for an evaluation. When you come back for the evaluation, it will be a play-based evaluation that takes about 1.5 to 2 hours. And what you can usually expect from that is it's generally a speech and language pathologist and a special education teacher that are the core of that evaluation team. But if in the screening there were other maybe like bigger concerns in either the area of fine motor or gross motor, or maybe other major health concerns, then you might also be evaluated by those people. But generally it is just the two speech therapists and the special education teacher. When children are nearing kindergarten, or when there is a concern for autism, then they will include a school psychologist in that evaluation process, because they're able to make determinations that the special education teacher and speech pathologist are not able to make. So the evaluation team does change depending on the needs of the child. Parent interview is a big piece of that evaluation because it's just a snapshot. So seeing your child for an hour and a half doesn't necessarily tell the whole picture. And so they really rely on parent report. So the same sort of tips that I shared about AzIP apply for this evaluation process, in that bring someone with you if you can, bring as much information as you can, write down your concerns, just because it can get a little bit overwhelming, especially in the evaluation when there's a lot of adults and they're asking things of your child. It can get a little chaotic. So I always recommend that you have some good notes. After the evaluation, they will schedule a team meeting with you. It's approximately usually 2 weeks later. They will not necessarily share any results with you at the evaluation, because they have to score everything and talk with the team members and talk about what the appropriate way to proceed is. So I know a lot of times parents are disappointed when they leave an evaluation and they've actually not learned anything about what's going to be happening for their child. And so I just always like to tell parents, you're not really going to find out much of anything right now, but it's generally, in my experience, about 2 weeks later that you come back for the multi-factor team meeting. In that team meeting, they will discuss the results of the evaluation and make a determination of eligibility. And so they will, for preschool children, it is very often just a developmental delay or a preschool severe delay category that they will qualify your child under. Usually when kids are in kindergarten or higher, there are more categories of eligibility, but in preschool, they generally just kind of put them in a bucket of developmental delay or severe delay. Just because so much in preschool, there's a big question about exposure often, like how much of this is an actual disability and how much of this possibly is just lack of exposure. So that's why you see a lot of preschool children with those more generic categories. Often they do not, unless the parent requests the school district to do an autism evaluation, the school district does not tend to do that for preschool children, in my experience. And I've not worked with every school district, so I don't want to say that nobody ever does that. But in my experience, they are happy to just get children in under that developmental delay bucket and then do that more complex testing later on. But as a parent, you have the right to request that. And then they have to, they don't necessarily have to do it if you've requested it, but they have to talk about it. And as a team, you can figure out if that's the best way for you to proceed or not. So I do encourage parents, if they have concerns, to ask for that specific testing be done.
Somebody had a question in the chat.
Oh, yes.
Can you expand upon lack of exposure? What is this in other words?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, that's lingo. We're always talking about lack of exposure in the preschool. So it's the idea that, you know, maybe you've just never given your child scissors and that's why they can't cut, right? So a lot of parents don't necessarily think about or maybe feel safe giving their 3-year-old scissors. And so when they come to the screening and they're asked to cut, the kid might never have held scissors. And so that can be the case, you know, if a child has not had exposure to a lot of outdoor play, they can have, you know, delays in their gross motor skills. Like it could be hard for them to jump or climb. But, you know, maybe the family lives in an apartment and they don't go outside a lot, or, you know, so we have to consider with really young children that they've only had a limited time in the world. And so they might not have been exposed to the things that we're expecting them to be able to do. And so once they get into the preschool environment and they're exposed to those things, a lot of times we see huge growth really quickly, especially in language and social skills, once children are around other children in the preschool environment. So we just call that lack of exposure. All right.
I got one more question for you.
Sure.
If a 3-year-old is in a preschool, will the preschool do a screening at the start of the year?
So I think that might depend on the preschool. If it's more of a daycare, I don't believe that daycares are required to follow that 45-day screening procedure. But if it's a preschool that's affiliated with a district school or something like Head Start, then they are required to do the 45-day screenings. All right, thank you for the questions. So if your child does qualify, then you will create an IEP, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. And then the services will begin to be provided after that. So the school district timeline, once the parent gives permission to evaluate, that is the start of the process. So a parent always has to give consent for an initial evaluation. No matter what age your child is, the parent has to agree to initiate this process. So even, you know, if a child is in middle school and the teaching team starts to have concerns about that child, the parent has to agree in order for this process to be initiated. And once the parent gives consent, that starts the official timeline that falls under the rules of IDEA. So once the permission has been granted, the district has 60 days to complete the evaluation. Ideally has 60 days to complete the evaluation. In my experience, the district timelines are not always adhered to, and there are a lot of reasons for that. There is right now a historically high number of children coming through the evaluation line. I had one district tell me that historically they've done about 100 evaluations a year, and last year they had to do 200. Also, school districts are short-staffed. You know, the professionals that complete these evaluations are very specifically qualified people and not always easy to find speech therapists and school psychologists to complete these evaluations. So, and while they are legally obligated to follow these timelines, it hasn't been happening in my experience lately. Once the evaluation is complete, they do have another 30 days to develop the IEP, the plan for services. Generally, school districts give you the evaluation results and have the IEP meeting in the same meeting. And they will ask your permission to be able to do that. But it saves another meeting and another step, and it saves time as well. So usually the district will share the results with the family, talk about the area that they're going to qualify under, and then kind of officially end that meeting with an agreement signature, and then ask you if you're okay with doing the IEP right in that moment, and then you'll sign to start the IEP process. I have not really ever worked with any families that were sad about that being squished a little quicker, especially because usually, as I mentioned, right, if it hasn't happened in 60 days, then it takes, it just makes the process go a little bit faster. The IEP that the district shares with you is a draft, and that's something really important to remember, that as a parent, as a family member, you are a very important part of the IEP team. You are the person who knows your child best. And so while the district will present a draft, your input is absolutely critical and encouraged in that process. So if you see something in there that you maybe don't agree with, or that you would like a little bit more attention given to, it is absolutely your right to have that document changed to better meet the needs of your child. Everything in this process is a team effort and a team decision, and parents are a really important part of that team. And then after the IEP is agreed upon and signed, the services are to begin. I believe the way that it's worded in the law is in a timely manner. And so that's not specific, it's not fantastic, but as soon as reasonably possible. So that can be dependent upon possibly transportation. If your child is going to be going to preschool and they need busing, sometimes that can take about 10 days to get that set up. Sometimes schools need vaccinations or different things before they're able to get your child in, or possibly like diapering accommodation plans, things like that. But the intention is that the services are to begin as soon as possible. Is there any questions about this before I move on? All right. Okay, so one thing that you hear a lot in the in everything that I've been saying is just thrown around this term IEP. And so that is an individualized education program. And that is basically the legal document that serves as a roadmap for your child. And it outlines the present levels of your student, what their needs are, exactly what services they're going to receive and by who, and what the specific goals that are going to be worked on are. There's a lot of other considerations given in the IEP. There's something called the least restrictive environment that has to be considered. We want to make sure that children are served with their typical peers as much as is possible, because we know that children learn best when surrounded by typical peers. And so that's a big consideration in writing the IEP. Time away from typical peers is also something that's considered in the IEP. Language of instruction and home language is something that's also discussed in the IEP. And that is directly derived from the information that's gained from the evaluation that has just been completed. And so the IEP is developed by the team, which is, the school district evaluators, the family, and any other person knowledgeable about the child. So the family is always allowed to bring additional people with them. If you have, for example, an ABA therapist that's been working with your child, or if you have a family advocate that you've been working with, you are absolutely encouraged to bring them to these meetings. The school district generally does appreciate a heads up of knowing who's going to come. But you are allowed, you can bring your uncle, you can bring your grandpa, like you can bring whoever you want to these meetings. And the IEP is a working document. So if you have this meeting and you agree to the IEP, and then you're laying in bed later on that night and you're thinking, I'm not really sure, I have a question about this, or maybe I don't want that much speech therapy because I don't want my child missing that much of the class, or you're able at any point to call that IEP team together and modify that document. So just always know that that is a living document and it is editable at any time. It is to be reviewed at least once a year and updated with new information, right? We know children grow and change rapidly. And so regardless of how often you might call a meeting to get it changed or amended, is what we call it, once a year, the team has to come together to create a new IEP.
I have a question. If you can.
Yes.
Someone's asked, if your child is screened and evaluated age 3, but doesn't attend a district preschool, who is required to provide services, or would they need to enroll on a district preschool?
That's a great question. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but districts generally have different options. So they might offer you a spot at their district preschool at that point when they do the evaluation. There is some children who are what we call dually enrolled, which means they go to the other preschool and then they also go to the district preschool to get their services. Sometimes sometimes districts provide drop-in services where parents can bring the kids in at a set date and time just for the therapy, like occupational or speech therapy. Sometimes districts will service kids at the daycare or the preschool that they're already attending. So when I worked for TUSD, I spent a couple of years as the itinerant special education teacher. And so I traveled all around Tucson and gave services in whatever preschool the kids were already in. I think TUSD is a bit unique in that just because they're such a huge district. It was, I think, logistically easier for them to just sometimes meet kids where they were rather than trying to, squeeze in the services in their own buildings. But there is a variety of options. And that is something that you'll talk about in creating the IEP. All right. So when you're going through this process, I always encourage parents to know that you are in collaboration with the school district, that your voice is important, that you are an advocate for your child, and that we want to presume positive intent as much as possible. I have never met a special education teacher that, really just didn't want to do a good job for the students. I think that people are well-intended and sometimes things get hard. And so when things do get hard, you have some options. The Arizona Department of Education does have a dispute resolution helpline that you can contact. as well as raising special kids. That's another advocacy outlet for you if you need help with the school district, if you feel like you've exhausted your options with the school district. I do always encourage parents to first start directly with the people that you're working with, to let them know what your needs are and or what your maybe what you wish you were receiving that you're not receiving. You know, start directly with the team that you're working with. So if that's the teacher, the evaluation team, and then if you're not getting what you need from that interaction, then I suggest like baby stepping, right? So then you might talk to the principal or the program coordinator. And then if that person doesn't feel helpful, then, you know, you could go to the special education director, and then finally to these two agencies to help you receive what you need. All right, so some things to remember through this process is to explore all of your options. So I know that families sometimes get really frustrated in working with the school district because it takes a long time. Maybe what they're offering feels kind of limited. But I always try to encourage families to go with a multi-factored approach. So talk to your doctor about what services are provided within the community. It is a lot easier in my experience for private therapies like the Therapy Group of Tucson or Mealtime Connections. They are able to qualify kids who have a much smaller delay than school districts are able to qualify kids. So if you have reached a dead end with your school district, still reach out to those community options because they can help you, you know, in a different way than your school district can. And I think that more is better. You know, when we're talking about helping our children succeed, it's always great, I think, to have more therapy. So do explore all of your options. I always encourage people to work collaboratively for the best outcomes. You know, make sure that if you do have private speech therapy and you're getting school district speech therapy, that you put those people in contact with each other so they can be working on the same things and that they're not, you know, on opposite ends of the spectrum, providing, you know, totally different things for your child. Also, early intervention is absolutely critical. And I know that sometimes as parents, we would take a wait and see approach, right? Like we think there might be something, but we're not really sure. But I have just seen so much growth that can happen in a short amount of time with really young children, right? Like our brain, when we're 3 years old, is still very pliable and very workable. So I just think that it's really important to not wait. And especially when it comes to getting services in place with the school district, because once a child enters kindergarten, schools sometimes want to hit pause on doing any evaluations. They want to give kids a little while to be in school. And so in my experience, if you don't have an IEP by the time you're out of preschool, you might not be evaluated until second grade because kids are rapidly, I think kids that sometimes show up for kindergarten and it's to that lack of exposure again, right? And so the districts want to just see and make sure of where kids are. So I always encourage parents to start this process before kindergarten because I've seen it take a long time. Excuse me. Also follow up. I see so many parents frustrated that the district hasn't called them. You know, nobody's reaching out to me. And I just think like we are the ones who have to be the best advocates for our kids. And so if people are not following up with you, then you follow up with them. And I know that can be frustrating, but I think that that is just the best way. And then again, just sharing information. If you have different therapies or different specialists that you're seeing, make sure that everyone is on the same page with what your child's getting, so the plan can be cohesive and collaborative. All right, so I know I already talked a little bit about service options, but when you're developing the IEP and you are trying to figure out what is the best placement for your child, you will first consider the least restrictive environment. And so that is the place that looks the most like a general education classroom. And then as we move through that, the term restrictive means, just a bit more, maybe more specialists, less children, more specialized supports. And so there's a whole variety of options that you have. So some children, like if they maybe just have an IEP for speech and language, the general education classroom with 30 minutes a week of speech might be what the least restrictive environment is. And that can go to then the next step would be a classroom that has a general education teacher with a special education teacher that pushes in for some number of hours. And then the next restrictive step would be a preschool classroom with 12 kids that the special education teacher is the teacher that's there all the time. So, there is a spectrum of services, and it's really important to have that conversation, and you're welcome as a parent to go and visit your options before you agree to anything. And I think that that's really important, especially when you're starting this process and you've maybe never stepped foot in a preschool and you don't really know what it looks like, or maybe even what questions to ask. I always encourage parents to ask the district to let them see what their choices are before they make it. And then sometimes children just qualify for related services. And so related services would be speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, sometimes orientation and mobility if your child has a visual impairment. And so those services can sometimes be provided on a drop-in basis. So the district might say, okay, every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, you can bring your kid here for 30 minutes and the speech therapist will work with them. So that's one way that those services can be provided, or other times they are just pushed into the classroom, which is, ideally what we want to be doing as an integrated approach.
I have another question in the chat.
Yes.
Do you have a list of community options for screening outside of the school district before they get to kinder? You mentioned a couple places. And we have a list that we can send out to people if they want, but do you have any suggestions, Karina?
So I think depending on the needs of your child, I've really had a lot of luck with Therapy Group of Tucson, just because they're a big outfit. And so it's easy to get in. You don't have to wait a long time for that screening to happen. But that's not a developmental screening, right? That's just if you need speech therapy or occupational therapy, if it's like a more specific something. I do rely heavily on the list that Kate is talking about. That there's a lot of good resources on there, including the developmental pediatricians, which is a lot of times where you want to go if you have concerns of autism or any other developmental concerns. You would want to go to a developmental pediatrician for those. So I am happy to send you the resource list that I have, and I can get your contact information from Kate after this if you guys all did the form. Is there any other questions?
Somebody else said that they would love that list too. Can you send it to me and I'll send it out with the recording and everything?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. I'm sorry to just unmute, but
That's
probably
perfect.
easier than typing. What is, and Kate, I might have had this conversation with you, and whoever it is that I had it with, it blew my mind in terms of sort of discrimination before entering kinder. Like, what can preschools do in terms of denying ability to accept the child to the preschool or reject? Like, are they, where is there protection for families, or can they just be pushed away by preschool until they find a place that either can accommodate or is willing to accept the student? Does that make sense?
Yes, it
Yeah.
makes sense. And this is a very hot topic of conversation. So no, preschools are not allowed to exclude because of disability. If that falls under the ADA, right, the Americans with Disabilities Act, like not even the IDEA that we've been talking about, but just the general Americans with Disabilities Act, right? You have to accommodate for individuals with disabilities. So preschools are not allowed to exclude because of a disability. Private schools, I think sometimes feel that they maybe have a little more leeway with that because they don't accept federal funds. But again, under the ADA, they are required, they're not allowed to exclude. In my experience, I've met lots and lots of families whose kids have been kicked out of preschool. So I can say what's legal, and I know that what happens is very different than what's legal. I don't know if that answers your question, or Kate, if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I think, it's, I don't know what as a solution is. It's a lot of, especially private ones they say that they can't meet the needs or they can't handle your child. And so they are pushed out and stuff like that. But the district is that they have to take you and accommodate for you. Like that's right. Like that's legal. So that is one place that you can go. If you're like me and had your child be kicked out of 3 schools in a month, you can the district can be a safe landing space for you. But yeah.
I think it's especially hard because even though legally they might not be able to kick you out, as a parent, you don't want to bring your kid back the next day to a place where they've told you they don't want your kid there. So I think that that's a really difficult place to be as a parent because you want your child to be loved and accepted wherever they are. And so, it puts you in kind of a hard spot because you don't want to push back just to keep your kid there when they don't want you there. So I think that in some ways places get away with it for that reason, that parents aren't going to push back because they want their kids to be loved and accepted. And then it becomes more systematic that they do that on a regular basis.
I have another question, if you don't mind. So you were talking about the early intervention, how do I say it? AzIP, yeah. So, and you said it's sort of hard to qualify. And so what would your recommendation be to families who don't qualify from AzIP? Like where are their alternative means of support, or what would you recommend to them if they don't qualify through AzIP? What next for them?
I really think, again, just those community resources. So getting any sort of private therapies that they're able to get. And I say private therapies, but they accept access and insurance. And so they are really available to people throughout the community. But that has been my best route, is to talk to their pediatrician to get any referrals that they might be able to get from the pediatrician, and then reach out to the community resources that Kate has. And I did talk about that difficult to qualify, but I didn't really mention that. You have to have a 1.5 delay in order to qualify, which means that you have to be delayed by 1.5 years in order to qualify. And so when you're only 18 months old, it's especially difficult to be 1.5 years delayed. So yeah, it is really tricky, but getting involved in community resources and play groups, different things like that can be really helpful in the interim. Scott, will you tell me what CIC stands for?
Community Investment Corporation. We sound like a bank, but we are not really. we do lots of different things. Some is sort of lending related, but Community Investment Corporation.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
I was making up a bunch of stuff in my mind. So.
And I actually I have another question. So if a family is evaluated outside of the school district and they have you know, a professional evaluation done, what does the school district do with that? I mean, I know you said bring any evaluation or any supporting documents, but are they required to sort of adhere to that diagnosis or plan or evaluation, or do they just say, thank you very much, we're going to do our own set, and you're just going to sit in line until we can get to you? Or do they take what has already been done and implement immediately, or do their own thing?
Well, I know that when I was an evaluator, I was always super excited when I was handed a bunch of testing somebody else had already done for me, right? Because it meant I didn't have to do it again. And it is best practice to not put kids through that testing process again. They do need to be current, and depending on the age of the child and the area, that could be anywhere from 6 months to 1 year. But they will incorporate that testing into the plan and should not redo any testing that was already done. I don't know necessarily that it super speeds up the process when you have your own testing, because it has to be, the reason why it's called a multi-factored evaluation is because they need to look at different things in order to make the determination. So there's standardized testing, there's observation, there's parent interview, like all of those pieces are needed. So I don't know that it goes any faster when you have your own documentation, but it is really helpful. And often testing that you get from outside the school district is very much more thorough and complete than what you're going to get in the school district.
For autism specific, also, I just to say that the school district, you bring in your own autism diagnosis from a medical professional, it's different than the school's diagnosis. So the school will do a lot. I feel like they're repeating a lot of stuff, but they have different requirements. So you can have a kid who has a medical diagnosis, but they don't actually qualify to have an autism diagnosis through the school. So they won't get an IEP that says that. It's just very nuanced about their level of need and the school and how they respond. But so that's just very autism specific. That those are two separate diagnoses and different formats for doing it.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And school districts, in my experience, are hesitant to do an autism diagnosis. They'll start with just the developmental delay. And so it's important that parents really advocate for that when they want it, because it is, or not when they want it, when they know they need it. Because it is really different, the medical diagnosis versus the educational diagnosis. And the medical diagnosis, in my opinion, is a lot more thorough than the school diagnosis. Any other questions?
Unknown caller.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It was nice to be here with you all today, and I'll make sure I get my list over to Kate so she can share it with you all.
Thank you so much. This is going to be a valuable resource for so many people. We're going to send it out in our Welcome to Autism packets that we send out people because it's such important steps for to handling all that early childhood stuff. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I will send out an email with the list from Karina and some other lists and information. And if you guys need anything at all, we're always here for you. And thank you so very much for coming. And thank you so much, Karina, all the wonderful information. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.